Hi, mine's Phil. I talking about politics, and it was Prime Minister's questions again yesterday, so I'm going to go over, as I usually do, the 6 questions from Keir Starmer, Leader of the Opposition, and 2 questions from Ian Blackford of the SNP, the second largest opposition leader, both of whom had Johnson over a barrel, really, and neither of whom got an answer to any of their questions. But there we go, that's how it runs nowadays. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, this is going to be a thing for now. We'll put a background up there, hopefully for the next one. But for now, I'm going to first of all pick out a question that was asked first of all. I don't normally pick out the ones from backbenchers, but this one was quite extraordinary. Didn't like this at all. A Tory backbench MP. Now, it is quite common for them to be fed questions, soft questions for the Prime Minister to answer that they want to answer. That's normal. All parties would do that in the same situation and indeed do. But this particular one, I thought this was outrageous. A backbench Conservative MP was using his question to plug his book. He's just about to publish a book, and that's what he used his question for. And then he asked something pointless about Brexit, which didn't even get an answer. I mean, that's appalling. You shouldn't be able to do that. Does anyone remember the Cash for Questions scandal? You're not supposed to, use your parliamentary privileges to make money. And of course, Boris Johnson helped him plug his book. Absolutely appalling. But anyway, on to the proper questions. Keir Starmer. First of all, noted, he says, this is a crucial moment if we're to gain control of the virus. Now, my personal view is I would look at it and say, actually, if I was going to be completely honest, we've passed that point. There was a crucial moment. It's gone. It's in the past. We can see it in our rearview mirror. We are now buggered, epically buggered. I'll talk more about that in another video. The reason why I think Starmer was saying this, even though I'm sure he would love to say, do you know what? You've screwed the whole thing up. Even if you were to make me Prime Minister, I'm not even sure what I could do at this point. I could make it better, but we're still headed for an absolute train wreck of a winter. Because that's the reality of it. But I think what he has to... You can't be defeatist as Leader of the Opposition. You've got to be able to say, look, we're at this time. If you act in the correct way, then we could make this all better. Knowing full well that Boris Johnson will not act in the correct way. And then later on he can say, well, if you'd have done this, could have been different. So Starmer then noted, for 8 days, we had 16,000 positive results missed, which I talked about earlier in the week. And then he said that means about 48,000 contacts not traced. He said, does the Prime Minister accept that this very basic mistake has put lives at risk? Now, the Prime Minister then responded by saying, first of all, that this is a problem we have fixed. He called it a glitch or a computer error. And he said that, it's been addressed. It's not a computer error and it wasn't a glitch. There was nothing, the program in question, Microsoft Excel, there's nothing wrong with it. Other than the fact it was the wrong program to be using. And he said of all the 16,000 people that he refers to have got their test results. But again, he wasn't talking about them. He was talking about the people who weren't traced. The 16,000 people who didn't get their test results when they should have done, that is an issue in itself. But the bigger issue, of course, are the people who need... Some of those 48,000 that weren't contacted, I mean, some of them you wouldn't have contacted anyway because our tracing program's a load of rubbish. Some of them wouldn't have isolated anyway, but then that's down to them, not the government. But many of them would have isolated. Some of them would have been infectious. Some of those people have now infected others because they didn't know they needed to isolate. That's the point. And, then the Prime Minister tried saying, look, as soon as we became aware of the problem, we brought in 800 people to chase these cases up. Oh, yeah. What good does that do? If you cannot trace people in 48 hours, the experts say, it's not effective. Because presumably the time it takes for someone to become infectious, having been in contact with someone who's tested positive. To say nothing of the fact that every extra day's delay is a day that now infectious person is spreading that infection to others. Worthless. And then he says he thinks it would reassure the House and the country to note that the missing data did not change the assessment of the epidemiology, the spread of the diseases. It would reassure people if that were true, but of course it is not true. Because what he's saying is, yeah, we messed up, oh, it was a big mess, but would you believe it? It didn't actually cause any problems. Phew, wow, we dodged a bullet there. No, we didn't. Because like I've just said, we've had a load of people walking around that were infected, that weren't told they needed to isolate, they didn't know they were infectious, pass that infection on to others. Those next lot of people also have been going around infecting others as well. You know, the other thing is trying to say that it hasn't caused an issue. Of course it's caused an issue. I've sort of tracked the profile of the number of new cases, and it looked very, very different. Before they found these cases, looked very, very different. It almost looked like it was coming to a plateau. You wouldn't have thought a peak. It's not going to peak anytime soon, I think, because while the government keep completely going against what the medical advice, the scientific advice says, you cannot think we're going to get away with this. We're not going to dodge the bullet on this one. We are headed for a train wreck of a winter. But it sort of looked like it might be plateauing. Oh, it doesn't now. Oh. It's vertical. The rate increase is vertical at the moment. It's horrendous. If when I'm doing this next, or when I'm doing a video on this in about a week's time, I shudder to think what it's going to look like. Shudder. But of course, the point is they didn't answer the question as well. Wasn't answering it. So then Starmer stood up and says, "Look, this isn't just a technical issue." He said it's a human issue, and you know, the attempted assurance from the Prime Minister doesn't wash. Now, he should have been clear on this point. I'll come to why in a minute. I did actually have to say, though, that I did see on social media, because I'm not able to watch these live anymore, because I'm working, so I have to work and do something else. So I have to come back and watch it later. And I saw mention on social media that this was like Keir Starmer back in his days as a prosecutor, prosecuting a case where the defendant's been caught on CCTV. In other words, so easy. And it was, Johnson absolutely banged to right. There was no getting away with this. All he could possibly do was evade the questions like he always does, but hope to goodness that nobody's listening to Keir Starmer, because here's the thing. Normally, the way he tries to evade the questions, he tries to muddy what it is Keir Starmer's saying. So someone listening might get the wrong impression about what Starmer's saying. There was no hope of that today. It was purely, or yesterday as it was purely about hoping to goodness that nobody was listening to Starmer. Because anyone that was, oh dear, there was no getting away from it. And the mood in the chamber was noteworthy. It took quite a while for any backbenchers to even cheer Johnson on, and that's what they're there for. They're only sat there to do that. Then Starmer said, look, in Manchester, some of the missing cases date back to September the 18th. It's like, oh, I didn't know that. I did know that a lot of people are not getting their test results back. I suppose this is an example of it. So that means that people were without their results for weeks. Weeks. And then Starmer said, look, there's 3 serious consequences to this. 1, it's much harder to contact people after so long. 2, even if they are contacted, for many of them, their period of self-isolation has already expired. So, you know, you're locking the stable door after the horse has bolted there. And 3, important decisions were made on local restrictions with the wrong data. He said £12 billion has been invested in the system, and yet a basic Excel error brings it down. Now, that is the point he really needs to be clear on, because he allowed Johnson in with the next one. He shouldn't have done. What he needed to make, it was true what he said, but what he needed to make, the Excel error was not in Excel. The Excel error was even used in Excel. What caused the error, I talked about this earlier in the week, but I didn't even know the full horror of the stupidity behind it. So what happened is, first of all, they were using Excel. Well, that's a spreadsheet program. Have you got some calculations to work out? No, then don't use Excel. Use Access for databases. If you must use Microsoft Office products at all, which they're fine for certain things, you could absolutely use Access. So they were using the wrong program, but it got worse than that. Worse than that. My partner uses Excel in her job, and I was telling her about this, and I was saying, you know, they'd run out of rows because they were, you know, on Excel. And she said, no, Excel's got like 1 million rows. She said it used to have hardly any. In her job, she used to have multiple spreadsheets to do one thing when it had limited number of rows. Now it's like 1 million. I said, well, I wonder what the problem is then. And then I found out the problem. They were using the older version of Excel, 2003 version of Excel. And then I thought, how does that... It's not just that that's stupid. I don't even know how that's possible. Because test and trace it's only been created this year. It's new. I pay a subscription to Microsoft, £8 a month, get all the Office products. Now, of course, it costs more for an organisation, sure, but you'd get a subscription and you get the latest version. How are they using 2003? How is that even possible? They've just set up new. Where have they got it from? You couldn't even get 2003 Excel. If I went to Microsoft and said, oh, I'd quite like the 2003 Excel, do you know that paperclip, I didn't mind it at all. They just say, no, we don't sell it. Look, it's the same cost for the new one. You use the new one. There's no bloody paperclip on it. Well, I don't understand how it's even possible. I understand how they can be that stupid. What I don't understand how it was possible for anyone to facilitate that stupidity. And then Starmer said, no wonder it's been described as intergalactic incompetence. It's a quote from someone on social media. I forget who did that, actually. Then he said, why at this crucial point did it take so long to catch this error and address it? To which the Prime Minister said, and again, this is why he should have been clear in the other bit. He said, well, you can't have it both ways. He calls it a human error and a basic Excel error. Which is it? I mean, first of all, it can actually be both, because who uses Excel? I mean, it's not an autonomous program, Boris. But of course, you'll know that because you paid all that money to Jennifer O'Curie for IT lessons. Of course, he didn't. We know what he paid her for. But he claims it was for IT lessons. So how come he doesn't even know how Excel works then? But then, Johnson said, look, the crucial thing is that, yes, there has been an error, but the data points we're looking at do not change the basic distribution of the disease. But of course it does. And even if it didn't, okay, let's say it didn't, that's still thousands who didn't get their results and tens of thousands who weren't contacted, some of whom will have been unwittingly infecting others instead of isolating. But that is what changes that distribution. It does change the distribution because you had people infecting others and that wouldn't have happened. That would not have happened because they'd have been isolating. Yes, we know some people wouldn't have isolated anyway. But many did. Many would have done. And they weren't told they needed to. Of course it has had. And then he quoted some local stats and emphasised the need for local measures alongside national measures. Important, I'll remember that in a minute. So then Starmer said, look, the Prime Minister says it doesn't alter the basic distribution, but thousands have been walking around when they should have been self-isolating. It patently has an effect on the basic distribution. And he said, if this was an isolated example, I think the British people might understand that. But there's a pattern here on care homes, protective equipment, exams, testing. The Prime Minister ignores the warning signs, hurtles towards a car crash, then looks in the rear mirror and says, what's all that about? It's quite literally government in hindsight, he said. Now, this was well phrased for a couple of reasons. First of all, this government in hindsight is a dig at Boris Johnson, who sometimes uses the phrase Captain Hindsight to refer to Keir Starmer. He's basically daring him to try and use it today. And also, just in general, it's very good. He needs to be seen as the Prime Minister in waiting. The Prime Minister in waiting needs to be seen in the public as the public's voice. A Prime Minister in waiting, by definition, only exists when a government are not doing their job by the people. Because otherwise, why would people want to replace a government that's doing them well? They don't. So what he's doing is he is being the voice of the people. He's saying, look, if this was isolated, I think people understand mistakes are made. But then he's pointing out all their errors. He said, look, care homes. A lot of people have been personally affected by the government's crass handling of care homes. Protective equipment. A lot of people work in the NHS or know someone who does, and they know the issue there. Same thing with care homes, actually. Exams. A lot of people affected there. Testing. A lot of people. So he's bringing in an awful lot of the population that have got first-hand experience of just how much the government have been cocking up, and that it's not an isolated cock-up. It is not. It's everything they're doing has been messed up. And then he noted that today, which is now yesterday, it's 100 days since the first local restrictions were used. And he said 20 areas in England have been under restrictions for 2 months. 19 of those areas, the infection rate has gone up. Ooh, because this is the thing. Boris Johnson keeps plugging this combination of national and local restrictions. Problem is, they're not working, are they? If you put an area under local restrictions and the infection rate goes up, by definition, they're not working. I mean, really, it should come down. At the very least, you keep a lid on it. But you can't let it go up. And then Starmer quoted a couple where it's gone up by 10 times as much. And then he says, but all the Prime Minister has to say is it's too early to say if restrictions are working. But it's obvious that something's gone wrong here. What is the Prime Minister going to do about it? And then, Johnson said, well, we're providing support for the Northwest, the Northeast, for those in extra restrictions. And then he tried to go on the attack and he said, 2 weeks ago, I set out that strategy and 2 weeks ago he supported it. Yet last night, the Labour Party abstained on the rule of 6 vote. And he said that Starmer can't even be bothered to get his own side to support these measures himself. Got a cheer from his backbenchers. First one, and I think the last one of the day, until he's grandstanding at the end. It was fairly short-lived, though. Now, what this is in reference to, by the way, is Keir Starmer gave his MPs a free vote on whether to vote for the rule of 6. Reason being, effectively, is the rule of 6 is all right. It is a measure designed to suppress the virus. The problem is that the overall package of measures is not effective. And what they'd like to vote for is an effective and consistently applied set of measures. So then Keir Starmer stood up and he said, look, for the Prime Minister's benefit, let's take this slowly for him. We support the measures to protect health, he said. Now that's important for later on as well, because he set a trap later on. He said, we support measures to protect health. We want track and trace to work. Wish he wouldn't call it that. Track is trace. I know the government call it that. That's why he's using it. Whatever. Then he said, but the government is messing it up and it is our duty to point it out. Let's get back to the questions because these are not trick questions. Then, if the statistics he produced last time weren't devastating, these ones were. He produced figures of the infection rates in some areas as they went into lockdown and again after coming out of local lockdown. He noted Bury. These are areas in the northwest, by the way, northwest of England. Bury, which had 20 cases per 100,000 when it went into local lockdown. Now it's got 266. Bolton, it was 21. Now it's 434. Over 20 times as much. Then Bolton, it was 18. Now it's 255. He said, Prime Minister really needs to understand that local communities are angry and frustrated. So will he level with these people from Bury, Burnley and Bolton and tell them what does he think is the problem here? The reason, by the way, he mentioned those. Bolton is a Conservative. It was tradition. All these areas in the northwest were traditionally Labour areas. Bolton is now controlled by the Conservatives. He's basically saying to the people of Bolton, you decided that Labour don't represent you and that Conservatives would do a better job. You might want to listen to what the Conservative Prime Minister has got to say to the fact that he placed you under restrictions and that your rate of infection's actually massively gone up. You might want to listen to this and then think about it next time you decide to vote. Very effective. The Prime Minister said, look, the problem is, alas, the disease continues to spread. As if it's just something he can't have any influence over. It's like, well, stand aside, mate, because Starmer thinks he can run things better. Give him a crack then. If you think it's just down to the virus and you can't do anything about it. And he said that the figures he's just given, referring to Starmer, are no surprise. He said because they are repetitions of what I've already told the House. But the problem is here, he's also told the House about the importance of local restrictions. Yet he is having to face proof that his measures are not enough. They're not working. He says, it's really important, this combination of national and local measures. Yeah, it is. I agree. But they're not working. So you should change them because they're not working. It's that simple. That all he has to do is grasp that, and Starmer doesn't have a problem. Just grasp the fact that you've put something in place. Okay, you tried it out. You didn't want to be too draconian. You tried something out. It ain't worked. You know what? Got to change it. Ain't working, mate. And and he said. And then he tried to go on the attack against Starmer again, but this time he didn't get a cheer from his own side because it's falling on. It's falling flat. He said, "What we are doing is a combination of, just in case people had forgotten, a combination of local and national measures, which one week he supports and another he whisks his support away." He said he can't be bothered to mobilise his own benches to support something as fundamental as the rule of 6. He said he turned back to his own MPs as if to remind them to cheer him because they weren't doing it at this point. I think a couple tried, but it was much more muted. And then he said, look, he can't have it both ways. Does he support it, yes or no? Which, by the way, first of all, it's a bit cheeky of him asking any questions. This is Prime Minister's questions. It's certainly cheeky for him to ask questions when he himself won't answer questions. And it's definitely cheeky for him to ask a yes or no question when he never answers yes or no questions, and didn't today either. If I was Starmer, do you know what? Starmer actually just stood up and said yes before going on. I'd have stood up and said, tell you what, I'll do you a deal. You answer my questions and I'll answer yours. I haven't got a problem with it being leader of the opposition's questions. Or better still, if you want to ask the questions, then as it's Prime Minister's questions, I'm quite happy to step up to the role of Prime Minister so that this country can be properly led. But in the meantime, absolutely, if at the end you wish to ask me a question, I've got no problem with that if the Speaker will allow it. But you answer my questions first. You haven't answered any yet. Answer them, then we'll talk. That's what I'd have said. He didn't. He just said yes. I suppose it's quicker. Then he said, but if the Prime Minister can't hear local communities when they say the infection rate has gone up tenfold under restrictions, he doesn't realise there's a problem, then that is part of the problem. He says there's a further case of anger. There was some heckling at this point from Tories backbenchers. Repeated it. It's a further cause of anger. And then he said, because the Prime Minister was one of the ones heckling, I think, he said, Prime Minister, if you'd actually listened to the question, we might get on better. Bit tetchy there. He said the lack of clarity about why particular restrictions are being introduced. So he's referring now to the expose earlier this week. He gave the example, this is always a good example to give, of the Prime Minister's own local authority, where he said there were 62 cases per 100,000. And yet there were no local restrictions. But he said in 20 local areas across England, local restrictions were in place where the infection rates were much lower, not just a bit. You know, he said in some, it's less than half the rate of infection as in Johnson's backyard. And he said, look, local communities genuinely don't understand the differences. Can he please explain it for them? Then Johnson said, look, he's heard, as if he's answered this all before, he said, look, he's heard from me and the government repeatedly about why we're differentiating. I've just given the figures, blah, 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 not answering it at all. And he said, I wish I could pretend everything was going to be rosy. It's like, well, you always pretend everything's going to be rosy. He is pretending. He's always pretending. He keeps saying it's going to be sorted by Christmas. And then somewhere else, he'll say that it's not. So then if you say, you said it would be over by Christmas, and he goes, I think you'll find I actually said the opposite. Because he says opposite things. Then whichever one you attack him for, he says, well, actually, at this place, I said that. Ridiculous. And the inconsistency, it's almost as annoying as his habit of answering questions that he's also pretending were asked. Because that's another thing. He pretends the questions that are asked. Certainly doesn't answer the questions that are asked. And then Johnson said, look, that's why we need a concerted national effort. We need to follow the guidance. We need hands, face, space, even though the actual expert guidance is the other way around. Got that arse about face. Now that I think about it, actually, this is the same thing he said last week. He's just giving the same answers he gave last week, isn't he? Couldn't we just do a recording of him and play it back to Keir Starmer every week? That would save Boris Johnson having to get up from his nap, because he's clearly tetchy when he has to disturb his sleep and come into Parliament. Yeah, maybe we should do that. Then he said he thinks it's extraordinary that Starmer would support the rule of 6 whilst allowing his entire party to abstain. Then Starmer got up for his 6th question, the one he can't come back. Now, this actually was very good. This was the trap for later, I think. He said, look, the Prime Minister can't explain why an area goes into restriction. He can't explain what the different restrictions are. He can't explain how restrictions end. This is getting ridiculous. Next week, the House will vote on whether to extend the 10 p.m. rule. The Prime Minister knows there are deeply held views across the country on different ways on this. One question is now screaming out, is there a scientific basis for the 10 p.m. rule? The public deserve to know, Parliament deserves to know. If there is, why doesn't the government do itself a favour and publish it? If it doesn't, why doesn't the government review the rule? Will the Prime Minister commit to publishing the scientific basis for the 10 p.m. rule before this House votes on it next Monday? Now, in answer to this, it comes as no surprise Johnson didn't answer it, and he just did his usual grandstanding because he knows that whatever twaddle he comes out with, Starmer can't come back at him. But this one was an ideal question 6 because it's not really a question. Well, it was a question, but it didn't need to be answered. Starmer is basically laying the groundwork to defeat the government next week. The 10 p.m. rule, which I need to cover in a separate video really, rather than waste too much time here, but look, I mean, I said at the time it appeared to have backfired. It really looks like it might be doing more harm than good. Certainly there's a groundswell of opinion that would suggest so. I would like to know what the scientific expertise is on that, myself, as Starmer would. But what he's doing, because obviously Starmer's made a big point of supporting the government's measures to protect health. That's why I said, remember for that for later. Earlier on he said, we support the measures to protect health. But it looks like he may not support this one. Now, this is a measure, but if you can argue that it's not to protect health, then that's why I think there's a lot of, or some Conservative backbenchers planning on voting against it. And I think Starmer's basically saying, I might support them. I might help them defeat the government on this. But there we go. But yeah, Johnson did his usual grandstanding. It's the usual thing, deliberately making up his own questions. Starmer constantly was asking him about local restrictions. Boris Johnson comes back with the national restrictions, which weren't the issue. Anyway, on to the SNP. Different tack here, but equally uncomfortable ground for Boris Johnson, you would think. He was doing it remotely. Now, I am going to have to point out, much better, Mr. Blackford. I remember earlier on when this remote stuff started being done, and he was, obviously, as you would expect, Scottish MPs, it's a hell of a trek to get down to London, particularly in the middle of a pandemic. So we did a few of these from home. It was hastily set up, I think, because it was very bad lighting. It wasn't a good setup for him. Perfect setup now. He's got it very well set up. Nice picture on the wall. The obligatory bookcases behind. Couple of bookcases. Everyone has to do that, don't they? Get bookcases behind them. Won't catch me doing that. Well, not for very long anyway. I will have a background soon. But anyway, he began by thanking various organisations, charitable organisations throughout the UK, it wasn't just Scotland, for helping families through difficult times during the pandemic, which is very nice. Then he referred to the looming mass unemployment and the need to have the right social security measures in place. He noted that the Chancellor has refused to make the £20 universal credit uplift permanent. The reason is obvious. The reason they created this uplift in the first place is universal credit was always there to screw over as many people as possible. But they know there's a limit. The problem was that with mass unemployment due to COVID, there's an awful lot of middle-class voters were about to see just how unfair the universal credit system is. And they might remember that come the next election. So they quickly bunged it up a bit. And it's been an absolute lifeline, particularly to the poorest in the country. But of course, it's going to end because they never really wanted to help people out with it. They just wanted to limit the number of voters that would see just how callous the system is that they had voted for. And then Blackford said, look, there's 16 million people, which just shows you how much poverty there is in this country. For a wealthy nation, this is absolutely disgraceful. 16 million people face the prospect of losing over £1,000 income overnight. Will the Prime Minister now commit to make the uplift permanent? To which Johnson welcomed Blackford's support for universal credit. And he said, look, we will continue to support people across the country. And he said that as a result of universal credit, there are 200,000 fewer people in absolute poverty now than there were in 2010. Now, he's done this before. This is not true. This is not based on any official figures. And he's been called out for these sort of lies before. But he doesn't care. Nor did he answer the simple yes or no question, has to be said. And Blackford wasn't letting that one go. He said, one of these days, the Prime Minister might consider to answer the question. It was about making the £20 uplift permanent. He noted the Joseph Rowntree Foundation made it clear. Strip the £20 and 700,000 more people, including 300,000 children, could move into poverty, and a further 500,000 people could end up in severe poverty. He said the Prime Minister has an opportunity here. Will he do the right thing? Will he answer the question? Will he make the uplift permanent? The answer to all three is no, not at all. That being said, he wasn't aggressive with it. He quite often is quite often aggressive with Blackford's questions because he's got nothing to lose. You know, Scotland is basically lost, and Ian Blackford appeals to Scotland. And although Boris Johnson has been saying this week that the union has never been stronger, we all know that that's crap. It has never been weaker, in fact. But it was the same question, so of course it was going to get the same response, not answer, because it wasn't answered in the first place. But that being said, what was interesting, he was not very aggressive about it. He said that he didn't want to underestimate what Blackford was saying. So he didn't want to dismiss what Blackford was saying. He said it's vital we tackle poverty in this country. And I think the reason he was so conciliatory is because this isn't just about Scotland. This is about the rest of the UK as well. And he's probably got in the back of his head, where there's plenty of room for it, the thought bouncing around that unlike Conservative governments in general, he is dependent upon quite a lot of MPs from poor areas who are not going to be impressed if Boris Johnson seems to be ignoring the plight of the poor. He needs to shaft the poor, but he really can't be seen to be doing so. So he repeated his earlier response, trying to fool people that he is putting things in place that are as good or better. I don't quite see how it's as good or better to remove £1,000 from people's income who are in poverty. That is a hell of a lot of money. I don't see how that benefits them, I have to say. And I'm also going to suggest that if the people at the sharp end of this policy also don't see that it benefits them, can they remember this and actually go out and bloody well vote next time? I think there should be some local elections on next year. Try and remember. But there we go. That was PMQs for another week. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.